If someone had told me 10 years ago that my life would be completely upended by Julian Blackwood standing on my doorstep in the middle of a Tuesday thunderstorm, I would have laughed. Not because it was impossible, but because Julian Blackwood, my best friend, was a creature of sunshine and certainty. He didn't do thunderstorms. He didn't do uncertainty. And he definitely didn't do my doorstep. His world was one of straight lines and solid foundations, a world that was about to be cemented by a wedding I was supposed to be the best man at. My world was the quiet space in his shadow, a place of muted colors and unspoken things. And the most unspoken thing of all was the fact that I had been in love with him since we were 17. My life was a carefully curated collection of routines. I woke up at 6:30. I drank exactly 2 cups of black coffee while checking emails. I worked from my spare bedroom-turned office, designing logos and websites for clients who only knew me as a name on an invoice. My apartment was my sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built from neat stacks of books, neutral-colored furniture, and silence. It was a life I had constructed brick by brick to keep the chaos out, to keep the longing contained. Julian was the one beautiful, chaotic element I allowed in. Or rather, he existed just outside my walls, a brilliant supernova I observed from a safe distance. We had been friends since high school, an unlikely pairing of the quiet art kid and the charismatic captain of the soccer team. He was all broad shoulders and easy laughter, a man who moved through the world with an effortless grace that I could only ever dream of. I was not. I was angles and hesitations, a chronic overthinker who found more comfort in the company of pixels than people. He was engaged to Clara. Clara, who was lovely and smart and laughed at all his jokes. She was perfect for him. They looked like a magazine cover, all gleaming teeth and complimentary outfits. I had helped him pick out the ring. I had listened to him practice his proposal. I had even designed their wedding invitations, my own heart a dull, persistent ache with every elegant swirl of calligraphy that spelled out their names together. Julian and Clara. It looked right. It felt like a punch to the gut. The distance between us had been growing for years, a slow, inevitable continental drift. But the engagement had turned that drift into a chasm. He was building a life, a proper adult life, with a wife and a mortgage and future children. I was still in the same 2-bedroom apartment, nursing the same impossible crush, my life feeling more like a placeholder than a reality. We were on different trajectories, rocketing away from each other. His wedding, just 3 weeks away, felt like the final, definitive severing. The end of an era. The end of the quiet, foolish hope I couldn't seem to kill. So when my doorbell rang at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, piercing the comfortable quiet of my evening, my first thought was that it was a delivery mistake. The rain was lashing against my windows, a biblical downpour that had started an hour ago and showed no signs of stopping. No one came to my apartment unannounced. Ever. I opened the door, and there he was. Julian. But not the Julian I knew. Not the sun-drenched, confident man from the magazine cover. This Julian was a shipwreck. His perfect hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping water onto my welcome mat. His expensive suit, the one he'd worn to his final tuxedo, fitting that afternoon, he'd texted me, was soaked through, clinging to his frame. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. They were wide, haunted, stripped of all their usual light. He looked lost, utterly and completely lost. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, swaying slightly, with the storm raging behind him like a physical manifestation of the chaos in his eyes. My carefully constructed walls, my fortress of solitude, crumbled to dust in that single, silent moment. "Jules!" My voice was a croak. He finally focused on me, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just shuddered, a full-body tremor that seemed to start his bones. I didn't think. I reacted. I grabbed his arm, the wet wool of his jacket course under my fingers, and pulled him inside. The sheer cold of him seeped through his sleeve, a shocking, damp chill that went straight to my core. I slammed the door shut, cutting off the roar of the storm, and the sudden silence of my apartment descended upon us, thick and heavy. He stood dripping on my hardwood floor, a puddle forming around his expensive leather shoes. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, diminished by the rain and whatever horror had brought him here. "It's over," he whispered. The words were so quiet I almost didn't hear them. They were cracked and broken, shards of sound in the still air. My heart did a painful lurch. "What's over?" I asked, though a cold dread was already coiling in my stomach. "I knew." "The wedding," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength, a sliver of hysteria. "It's off. Clara." She called it off, and just like that, the world tilted on its axis. The chasm between us vanished. The separate trajectories, the different futures, they all collapsed into this single, impossible moment in my hallway. He wasn't rocketing away from me anymore. He had crashed, right here on my doorstep. My first coherent thought was a selfish, monstrous thing, a tiny, wicked spark of hope that I immediately tried to extinguish, ashamed of its very existence. My second thought was for him. The devastation on his face was real. It was a raw, open wound. "Come on," I said, my voice firmer now. I took his hand. It was freezing, his fingers stiff and unresponsive in mine. I led him into the living room, my mind racing. Towels, dry clothes. There, something warm. I was running on autopilot, my body moving through the familiar motions of care, while my brain struggled to process the new reality. Julian Blackwood, the man who had his entire life mapped out, was sitting on the edge of my sofa, dripping rainwater and despair onto the cushions. And he was holding my hand. I brought him a towel and my largest, softest hoodie. He took them without a word, his movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet with its strings cut. I watched him from the kitchen as he clumsily toweled his hair, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked alien in my living room, too big, too vibrant, even when dimmed by grief. He was a slash of bright, chaotic color in my muted, grayscale world. I noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to notice in years. The way a few strands of his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck. The sharp line of his jaw, now tight with tension. The sheer physical presence of him, a solid, breathing reality that filled my small apartment to bursting. For so long, I had kept him at a distance, a carefully curated image in my mind. Now he was here, real and broken and painfully close. He peeled off his wetsuit jacket, then his shirt. My breath hitched. I turned away quickly, my face hot, focusing on boiling water for tea, as if it were the most important task in the world. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as he pulled on my hoodie. When I turned back, he was enveloped in gray fleece, looking younger and infinitely more vulnerable. The hoodie was too small for him, the sleeves ending just above his wrists, but he seemed to shrink into it, pulling his knees up to his chest. I set a mug of chamomile tea on the coffee table in front of him. He stared at it as if he didn't know what it was. "She said she couldn't do it," he said to the mug, his voice hollow. "She said she's been feeling it for months. That I wasn't really there." Not completely, my stomach twisted. Not completely there. I knew what that meant. I had seen it. The slight hesitation before he kissed her. The way his eyes would sometimes glaze over, looking at something far away that no one else could see. I had always told myself I was imagining it, projecting my own stupid hopes onto him. "She said I felt distant," he continued, his voice cracking on the last word. "Like I was holding something back. And God, Leo, maybe I was. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, terrifying confusion. He was looking at me for answers. Me, the man who had made an art form out of holding things back. The irony was a bitter pill. I sat down on the armchair opposite him, the space between us feeling both like a mile-wide canyon and a single, taut string. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt pathetic. "It'll be okay" felt like a lie. So I just sat there, a silent witness to his unraveling. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the only sounds the ticking of the clock on my wall and the faint, fading drum of the rain outside. He didn't touch his tea. He just stared into the middle distance, lost in the wreckage of his life. I watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap. I saw a small, faded scar just above his right eyebrow, a relic from a childhood fall I had completely forgotten about until this moment. I saw the exhaustion etched in the faint lines around his eyes. It was in this quiet observation that something shifted. The awe I always felt around him, that sense of him being a creature from another, brighter world, began to dissolve. Here, in the dim light of my living room, stripped of his confidence and his perfectly planned future, he was just a man who was hurting, and a man who had come to me. Eventually, his breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had slumped sideways on the sofa, his head resting awkwardly against the armrest. He looked deeply uncomfortable but utterly spent. I stood up and went to my linen closet, pulling out the thick quilt my grandmother had made. It smelled faintly of lavender and disuse. As I gently draped it over him, my fingers brushed against his cheek. The contact was electric. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the icy chill from earlier. A faint roughness of stubble scraped against my fingertips. It was the barest, most accidental of touches, but it sent a jolt straight through me, a bolt of lightning that lit up every nerve ending in my body. My heart, that frantic trapped bird, beat a panicked rhythm against my ribs. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. Stop it, I told myself fiercely. He's broken. He needs a friend. Not this. But the feeling lingered. The warmth of his skin on my fingers. The sudden, overwhelming reality of his closeness. I stood there for a long moment, watching him sleep, my own longing a physical weight in my chest. This was a dangerous, fragile, new territory. He was vulnerable. I was vulnerable. And we were trapped in the quiet intimacy of my apartment together. I turned off the main light, leaving only a small lamp burning in the corner, and retreated to my room. But I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room, a steady, rhythmic presence that had fundamentally altered the silence of my home. The fortress had been breached. The chaos was inside, and I was terrified. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, staring at my coffee machine as if it were a complex alien artifact. He was still wearing my hoodie and his damp suit trousers, which were now wrinkled beyond recognition. The morning light was merciless, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and the pale, drawn quality of his skin. "Morning," I said softly. He jumped, startled. "Now, sorry. I didn't know what to do. It's okay." I moved past him, the familiar routine of making coffee a welcome anchor in the churning sea of uncertainty. "How are you feeling?" A stupid question. He looked how he was feeling. He looked like hell. "Like I got hit by a truck," he mumbled, running a hand through his messy hair. And then the truck backed up and hit me again. He let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "I should go. I've imposed enough. Don't be an idiot," I said, maybe a little too sharply. I handed him a mug of coffee. "You're not imposing. Where would you even go?" He flinched. "I don't know. My apartment. Clara's still there, packing her things." I can't see that. Then you stay here," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. It was strange, hearing that decisiveness in my own voice. For years, our dynamic had been set in stone. He led, I followed. He spoke, I listened. Now, his foundation had crumbled, and he was looking to me for solid ground. I was terrified I was nothing but quicksand, but I couldn't let him see that. I had to be the rock. For him. He looked at me, his eyes full of a raw, desperate gratitude that made my chest ache. "Thank you." Leo, the day passed in a strange, surreal haze. I canceled my work calls, emailing clients about a sudden personal emergency. Julian just sat on my couch, staring blankly at the television screen without really seeing it. He didn't talk much. He just existed in my space, a silent, brooding presence. The silence in my apartment was different now. It wasn't the peaceful, comfortable silence of solitude. It was a silence filled with his grief, his confusion, his unspoken questions. It was heavy. I found myself watching him, studying the way he held his coffee mug with both hands, as if for warmth. The way he'd absent-mindedly rubbed the scar above his eye when he was lost in thought. I was learning the cartography of his sorrow, tracing its lines on his face. That afternoon, his phone, which had been silent on the coffee table, buzzed to life. The screen lit up with a picture of him and Clara smiling on a beach somewhere. The name Clara glowed brightly. Julian stared at it, his face a mask of anguish. The phone buzzed again, and again. He didn't move. He just looked at it, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the sofa. I walked over, picked up the phone, and held the power button until the screen went black. I placed the inert rectangle back on the table. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I should talk to her, maybe," I said, sitting on the coffee table so I was facing him. "But not right now. Not when you look like you're about to fall apart. I think I already have," he whispered. And then he did something that shattered my composure completely. He leaned forward, rested his forehead against my knee, and his shoulders began to shake. He didn't make a sound, but I could feel the silent, racking sobs vibrating through me. A grown man, the strongest man I knew, was weeping against my leg. My first instinct was to freeze, to retreat into myself. This was too much, too intimate, too close. But then I looked down at the top of his dark head, at the vulnerability in the curve of his neck, and a different instinct took over. The instinct to comfort. Hesitantly, I raised my hand and placed it on his back between his shoulder blades. The fleece of the hoodie was soft, but beneath it, I could feel the hard, tense muscles, the tremors of his grief. I started to rub his back in slow, awkward circles. "It's okay," I murmured, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "Just let it out." He stayed like that for a long time, his silent grief a physical weight against my leg. And I just kept rubbing his back, my hand moving in a steady, repetitive motion. In that moment, the power dynamic between us didn't just shift, it inverted. He was the one who needed saving, and I, somehow, was the one with the lifeboat. It was a strange and terrifying feeling. Eventually, the shaking subsided. He slowly lifted his head, his face blotchy and his eyes red-rimmed. He didn't pull away immediately. He just looked at me, his gaze clear and direct for the first time in 24 hours. "No one's ever seen me like that," he said, his voice thick. "I'm not no one, Jules," I replied softly. "I'm me." A flicker of something I couldn't name passed through his eyes. He finally leaned back, putting a little space between us, but the air was still charged, thick with unspoken emotions. The world had shrunk to the space between my armchair and my sofa, to the two of us sitting in the quiet afternoon light. That night, I insisted he take my bed. He argued, but he didn't have the energy to fight me on it. I set myself up on the sofa with the quilt, but sleep was even more elusive than the night before. I was too aware of him, just a thin wall away, sleeping in my bed, surrounded by my things, by my scent. My home, my sanctuary, was now inextricably linked with him. I must have drifted off at some point, because I was jolted awake by a sound. I sat up, my heart pounding. Julian was standing in the doorway between the living room and the hall, a silhouette against the dim light from my bedroom. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "Me neither," I admitted. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat on the far end of the sofa. The cushion dipped with his weight, and I could feel the warmth of him even from a few feet away. "This is weird, isn't it?" he said into the darkness. "A little," I agreed. "Everything was planned," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The wedding, the honeymoon in Italy, the house we were going to buy in the suburbs. It was all laid out. A perfect blueprint. You love blueprints," I said. He laughed, a real laugh this time, though it was tinged with sadness. "Edo, I like knowing how things are going to be built. I like knowing they'll be strong." He paused. Clara was right. I was distant. I was going through the motions, ticking the boxes. Husband, father. I thought if I just followed the plan, the feelings would catch up. That I would eventually feel the way I was supposed to feel. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The way I was supposed to feel. "And you didn't?" I asked, my voice tight. He was silent for a long time. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall again, each second a tiny hammer blow against the stillness. "When I was with her," he said finally, his voice strained, "especially when things got quiet or intimate, I would find myself thinking about something else. Someone else." The air left my lungs in a rush. "Don't hope. Don't you dare hope." I'd think about conversations we've had. He continued, his voice getting closer. I realized he had shifted on the couch, turning towards me in the dark. About stupid movies we watched when we were kids. About the time you stayed up all night helping me study for my physics final. About sitting in your old car, just talking for hours about nothing. He was so close now, I could feel his breath on my face. The scent of him, my soap, my laundry detergent, but underneath it all, just him, filled my senses. My entire world had narrowed to this single point, to this confession in the dark. I kept telling myself it was just friendship, he whispered, his voice thick with a dawning, terrifying realization. That you were my best friend, my anchor. But it was more than that. It's always been more than that, hasn't it? I was just too afraid to see it. He reached out, his hand finding mine in the darkness. His fingers were warm, and they laced through mine with a hesitant certainty. It wasn't an accident this time. It was a choice. Leo, he breathed my name like a prayer, like a question, and I couldn't speak. I couldn't form words. The confession I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times over the years, the eloquent speeches, the desperate pleas, they all dissolved into nothing. All that was left was this one, simple, overwhelming truth. So I leaned forward. I closed the small gap between us, and I kissed him. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss like in the movies. It was slow, tentative, a question asked in the dark. His lips were soft, hesitant against mine. For a second, nothing happened. He was just still, and a bolt of pure, cold panic shot through me. Oh God, I misread everything. I've ruined it all. But then he made a small sound, a soft sigh of surrender, and he was kissing me back. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was a kiss of discovery, of years of unspoken things finally finding a voice. It tasted of chamomile tea and salt and a decade of longing. It was gentle and searching and devastatingly honest. It felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We didn't speak. We just sat there in the dark, our hands still clasped together, the truth of what had just happened hanging in the air between us. It was fragile and new and terrifying and beautiful. I woke up alone. The first thing I registered was the cold. The quilt was pulled around my waist, but the space beside me on the sofa was empty. The sun was streaming through the windows, bright and cheerful and utterly at odds with a knot of ice forming in my stomach. I sat up, my heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm. The apartment was silent. Too silent. Juliet? I called out, my voice raspy with sleep. No answer. I scrambled off the couch and rushed to my bedroom. The bed was made. Not perfectly, but the duvet was pulled up, the pillows plumped. A clear sign of a hasty departure. I checked the bathroom. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. His wet suit from the night before was gone. His shoes were gone from the mat by the door. He was gone. The air rushed out of my lungs, and I had to grip the kitchen counter to stay upright. A wave of nausea washed over me. He was gone. He had left without a word, without a note. After last night, after that kiss, my mind, my worst enemy, went into overdrive. It was a mistake, a moment of grief-fueled madness. He was confused, heartbroken, and he had latched onto the nearest source of comfort. Me. I was a momentary lapse in judgment, a port in a storm. And now, in the clear, harsh light of day, he had realized his mistake and fled. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, creeping flush that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. How could I have been so stupid? I had taken advantage of his vulnerability. I had pushed him. I had misinterpreted everything. He didn't feel the same way. He was just lost, and I tried to show him a map that led directly to me. I spent the next hour in a self-destructive spiral of doubt and recrimination. I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, searching for signs of hesitation, of regret. Had I imagined the way he'd sighed? Had I misinterpreted the touch of his hand on my face? Every memory was now tainted with the bitter taste of my own foolishness. The silence of my apartment, once a comfort, was now a suffocating presence. It was no longer my silence. It was his absence. The dent in the sofa cushion where he had sat, the faint scent of him on my pillow, the extra coffee mug sitting by the sink. They were all cruel reminders of the brief, beautiful moment I had dared to believe in. My old life, my solitary, routine-driven life, had returned. But it was different now. It was haunted. The hours crawled by. One day bled into the next. I tried to work, but I just stared at my screen, the colors and shapes blurring into a meaningless soup. I didn't eat. I barely slept. I just waited. For a text. A call. Something. Anything. But there was nothing. Just a crushing, absolute silence. The hope that had sparked to life within me withered and died, leaving behind a cold, gray ash. He was gone. He had gone back to his life, to sort out the mess with Clara, and he had left me behind in the wreckage of mine. The chasm between us had returned, wider and deeper than ever before. I had crossed it for one brief, miraculous moment, and now I was stranded, with no way back and no way forward. By the third day, a dull, resigned despair had settled over me. It was over. Whatever it was over before it had even begun. I had to accept it. I had to rebuild my walls stronger and higher this time. I had to go back to observing him from a distance, back to my place in his shadow. It was the only way to survive. I was standing in my kitchen, finally forcing myself to eat a piece of toast when the doorbell rang. My entire body went rigid. My heart leaped into my throat, a wild, frantic thing. It couldn't be. It was probably just a delivery. A neighbor. Anyone but him. I couldn't face him. Not now. Not after 3 days of silence and self-flagellation. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I walked to the door on legs that felt like they were made of wood. I looked through the peephole. It was him. He looked different. He was wearing his own clothes, jeans, and a simple black t-shirt. He was clean-shaven. The haunted, broken look was gone from his eyes. He just looked nervous. He was holding a small, crumpled paper bag in one hand. My hand trembled as I unlocked the door. I opened it just a crack, using my body to block the entrance. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. He looked exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the soul-deep weariness of grief, but the simple fatigue of someone who hadn't slept. I couldn't find my voice. I just stared at him, a storm of anger, relief, and hurt swirling inside me. "Can I come in?" he asked. I hesitated. Letting him in felt like a surrender. But leaving him on the doorstep felt like a cowardice I couldn't stomach. I stepped back, opening the door wider. He walked in, and the silence that had been my tormentor for 3 days was suddenly filled with his presence again. He didn't sit down. He just stood in the middle of my living room, turning the paper bag over and over in his hands. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he began, his voice raw, "for just leaving. That was a shitty, cowardly thing to do. There's no excuse for it, why?" The word came out as a broken whisper. It was the only question that mattered. He finally looked at me, his gaze unflinching. Because I was terrified. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life, about what I wanted, it all came apart in this room. And that kiss, he shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. That kiss was the most real thing I've felt in years. And it scared the hell out of me. My anger began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. Fear. I knew fear. Fear was my native language. I had to figure things out, he continued, his words coming faster now. I couldn't just fall into your life without dealing with the mess of mine. It wouldn't have been fair to you. So I talked to Clara. Really talked to her. For hours. We ended it. Properly. Kindly. She deserves someone who is all there for her. Someone who isn't thinking about his best friend when he's supposed to be thinking about her. He took a step closer, and then I had to think. About us. About 10 years of me being a blind idiot. Of not seeing what was right in front of me the whole time. You. It was always you, Leo. I just didn't have the courage to admit it to myself. Tears were welling in my eyes, hot and sudden. I tried to blink them back, but it was useless. "I'm not confused anymore," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. He closed the remaining distance between us, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "But I'm still scared. This is new. For me. And I'm probably going to screw it up. But I want to try. If you'll let me. if I haven't already destroyed everything. He looked down at the crumpled paper bag in his hands, as if just remembering it. He held it out to me. I brought you something, he said, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. It was the most endearing thing I had ever seen. I took the bag. Inside were 2 croissants from the little bakery down the street. The one I loved. The one I had taken him to once, years ago. He remembered. It was such a small gesture. So simple. But it was everything. It was a promise. A beginning. It was him saying, I see you. I remember you, Julian, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. I know this isn't a grand romantic gesture, he said, misinterpreting my silence. I want to have breakfast with you, and lunch, and dinner. I want to wake up with you, and not run away like a coward. I want to build something new, something real. With you. He reached out and gently took the bag from my hands, placing it on the coffee table. Then he took both of my hands in his. Is that okay? He asked, his vulnerability laid bare. The confident, untouchable Julian Blackwood was gone. In his place was this man, my friend, looking at me with hope and fear and a love so profound it stole my breath. I didn't need words anymore. I surged forward and kissed him again. This time, there was no hesitation, no tentativeness. It was a kiss of relief, of certainty, of coming home after a long and lonely journey. It was a promise. The following weeks were a strange and wonderful dream. We moved slowly, cautiously, as if learning a new language. The language of US. We learned how to exist in the same space, not just as friends, but as something more. It started with breakfast, with him making coffee, too strong, the way he liked it, and me toasting the croissants. We would sit at my small kitchen table, the morning sun streaming in, and we would just talk. We talked about everything and nothing. We filled in the gaps that had grown between us over the years, the spaces that had been occupied by secrets and unspoken feelings. Then came a nights. The first time he stayed over again, after that clarifying conversation, I was a wreck of nerves. I offered him the bed, ready to retreat to the couch, to our old, safe dynamic. He just smiled, a soft, gentle thing. No, he said, I'm not sleeping anywhere you're not. Sleeping in the same bed was a revelation. It wasn't about sex. Not at first. It was about presence. It was about the simple, profound comfort of having him there in the dark. The weight of his arm draped over my waist. The sound of his steady breathing next to my ear. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone in the dark. The silence of the night was no longer empty. It was peaceful. We created new routines. We'd cook dinner together, bumping into each other in my tiny kitchen, a clumsy but happy dance. We'd watch movies on the couch, but this time he would pull me close, my head resting on his chest, his fingers idly tracing patterns on my arm. My carefully curated fortress of solitude had become our shared home. It was still quiet, but it was a warm, living quiet, filled with the hum of our shared existence. One Saturday, he showed up with 2 large boxes. What's this? I asked. A few of my things, he said, a little sheepishly. My lease is up at the end of the month, and well, I was hoping I could maybe leave these here. He opened one of the boxes. It was full of his books, thick architectural tomes and dog-eared fantasy novels we'd read as teenagers. He started slotting them onto my meticulously organized shelves, his books mingling with mine. The sight of it, our 2 separate lives, our 2 separate histories, merging on a single shelf, made my heart ache with a fierce, protective joy. It wasn't a perfect, fairy tale transition. There were moments of fear, moments of awkwardness. Sometimes I would catch myself falling back into old habits, treating him with a careful distance, afraid that this new reality was too fragile to touch. And sometimes I would see a shadow pass over his face, a flicker of the old grief or guilt, and I would worry that I was just a rebound, a convenient comfort. But whenever those doubts crept in, he would seem to sense it. He would reach for my hand. He would pull me into a hug and just hold me, his chin resting on the top of my head. He would look at me with such open, honest affection that my fears would simply melt away. He was learning my language, the language of quiet reassurance, just as I was learning his the language of open-hearted courage. My life, which had once been a straight, predictable line, was now a beautiful, chaotic, wonderful mess. There were his shoes by my door, his toothbrush in my bathroom, his laughter echoing in my once silent apartment. The colors of my world were no longer muted. They were vibrant, brilliant, saturated with his presence. He wasn't a supernova I was observing from afar anymore. He was my son. I look back on the man I was before that rainy Tuesday night, and I barely recognize him. He was a man living in the margins, a ghost in his own life, so afraid of getting hurt that he had preemptively shut himself off from any possibility of joy. He had built his walls so high he couldn't see the sky. Julian's arrival wasn't just a disruption of my routine, it was a demolition. He didn't just breach my walls, he tore them down with his bare hands. And then he stood in the rubble with me and helped me build something new, something better, something shared. Love, I've learned, isn't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your carefully constructed life. It's about finding someone who is willing to get messy, to knock down some walls, and to build a new life with you. Blueprint be damned. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the beautiful, unexpected turn that led me not just to him, but back to myself. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the trajectory of your life? A single event or conversation that divided your world into a before and an after? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. It's funny how the biggest changes can start with something as simple as a knock on the door. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing for more stories about love, loss, and all the beautifully complicated moments in between.